Good afternoon and welcome to the Easton Book Festival. We're very glad that we have sponsorship from Lafayette College, the Greater Easton Development Partnership, Pennsylvania Association for the Education of Young Children, Monarch Furniture, Kelly Nissan, Fidelity Bank, and many more. Now today we have Eric Laursen, the author of Polymath, and interviewed by Melissa Hope Ditmore. And I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you. Eric Laursen is an independent historian, journalist, and activist, and he has just written Polymath, The Life and Professions of Dr. Alex Comfort, who wrote The Joy of Sex. I'm going to ask him some questions about the book, starting with, who was Alex Comfort? Tell us what kind of polymath he was.
Okay, Alex Comfort actually, interestingly enough, in the United States in the 1970s, Alex Comfort was a household name. He was the author of The Joy of Sex, which was a 12 million copy bestseller. It topped the New York Times bestseller list for 13 weeks, hardcover nonfiction. And it's sold in the millions in various languages and editions ever since then. It was probably also one of the most recognized titles in publishing, even up to today. I've talked to people in their 20s who may have never seen the book, but if you say Joy of Sex, they oh yeah, there's a book called The Joy of Sex. So he's kind of entered into legend. But who was he really? Well, Alex Comfort was born in 1920, died in 2000, and he was a British physician, biologist, sexologist, novelist, poet, political activist, one of the founders of the nuclear disarmament movement in Britain after the war. He was an anarchist political theorist. He was a philosopher of science. He was a gerontologist, which means that he studied the aging of the human body. He was a geriatrician, which means that he was a physician who was involved in treating people who were elderly. He was a ham radio operator. He was an anti-war activist. And so that's why the title of the book is Polymath, because he was one of these people, like anyone from Benjamin Franklin to Leonardo da Vinci, who did a huge number of things across a lot of fields and wasn't sort of a dilettante. He was involved very deeply in each of these areas, and he made left his mark on them. So, and that's partly what got me interested, is that he had such a various career. He was, just to give you a quick sketch, he was attended Highgate School in London on a scholarship. He attended Trinity College, Cambridge on a scholarship. He was for many years at University College London as a biologist and gerontologist. He started writing about sex actually a good 25 years before The Joy of Sex came out. In the late 40s, he was one of the first people in the UK to review the Kinsey Report when it came out, which is a landmark study of American males and then American females' sexual behavior. And he was an advocate for sexual freedom and for the rights of sexual minorities for the rest of his life after that. He was, in the 60s, he was, as I said, very active in the Ban the Bomb movement in the UK. In 1961, he and Bertrand Russell and about 31 other activists were jailed for a month for promoting a sit-down demonstration against the bomb, against the presence of American nuclear bases on British soil, which made him sort of a notorious figure in government circles. At the same time, he was one of the better-known public intellectuals in the UK. He was regularly on the BBC, radio and TV, talking about nuclear disarmament, about human biology and aging, and about sex. He wrote The Joy of Sex in the early 70s because for a number of reasons, but one of the most salient thing is that there were two big bestsellers which came out in the United States in those years. One of them was called Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask. The other was called The Sensuous Woman, and they were huge bestsellers. And Alex was appalled by them because he felt they, in the guise of being liberating and freedom-affirming books, they actually perpetuated a lot of bad attitudes and misinformation about sex. Alex had initially got involved in writing and speaking on the subject because he felt that, we're talking about the post-war years when things were still pretty buttoned down, and he felt that the first line of defense, if you were a couple who was concerned about your sex life, was to go to your doctor. But doctors provided nothing but misinformation. They weren't trained to be counselors or therapists, and they wound up spreading lots of misinformation and bad notions about sex. And so he had felt all along that the key was to provide people with accurate information about what people really do when they have sex. The two books that I mentioned, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex and The Sensuous Woman, he thought were providing popular advice that was leading people the wrong way, and so he decided to write a sex manual of his own. Now, the key thing to know about this is that sex manuals were nothing new. They had been around for thousands of years in classical India, classical Japan, Renaissance Italy. They were a very common thing, but they'd sort of died out, and they were really kind of artifacts. All there was to replace them was really fairly sleazy, cheesy books that people could buy through the mail that also provided a lot of misinformation. So Alex decided the way to get to promote sexual freedom and to promote a better attitude and a less anxious attitude towards sex was to write a sex manual for the modern age. And so that's essentially what he did with Joy of Sex. After that book became a huge success, he moved to the United States, and he started writing poetry and novels again. He also started writing some very challenging books one about human consciousness and how it's generated, and then one about the evolutionary role of mysticism and religion in human development, which are wonderful books. They're not easy to read. And that was one of the bigger challenges to me in writing my book, is trying to sort of understand these books and how they fit into his larger project. He moved back to the United States in 1985, partly, he said, to give hell to the Thatcher government, which he was really angry at, which he did, partly through newspaper columns and partly through a really funny satirical novel he wrote called The Philosophers, which is, I think, the first novel about computer hacking. Inadvertently or inadvertently. In 1991, he had a massive stroke, and he was disabled for the last 9 years of his life, although he was still able to produce one more volume of poetry and one more book of anarchist essays. So he wound up writing over 50 books in his career, but The Joy of Sex and its sequel, More Joy of Sex, of course, were the ones that were the big hit. Later in life, he was sometimes asked what he thought about that, and he used to sometimes refer to Joy of Sex as his albatross, because it kind of was the thing that sucked all the air out of all the other stuff he had done, at least in sort of the popular mind. But he never regretted having written it. He always thought this was a good thing he had done to sort of combat misinformation about sex and to promote a less neurotic, less anxious attitude towards the whole idea of sex. So that's a little bit of a quick sketch of who he was.
That's a nice sketch of who he was, and it makes us all more interested in knowing more about Alex Comfort. And the book is a fun read with more detail, as you can tell. I'd like to ask, how did you get interested in writing about him?
Well, I can tell you about that at a little less length. Like a lot of people, I discovered the book, The Joy of Sex, when I was around 13 years old. I was in a bookstore in San Francisco, and I saw a big display of this book, And so naturally, as a 13-year-old, I saw this rather austere-looking cover that said, "The Joy of Sex." And so I went over to take a look at it, sort of furtively looking at the drawings and the paintings and so forth, and hoping that nobody would come up and tell me, to put that book down. I was too young to read it or anything like that. So it was a thing. A few years later, I'm in college, and I was looking up a reference book called Contemporary Poets, and I ran across Alex Comfort, and I thought, wait a second, that's not the same guy who wrote Joy of Sex, and that's interesting. A number of years after that, I was writing a book on the history of the Social Security debate in the United States, and so old age pensions. I had to learn a little bit about sort of the science of aging, what people knew about life expectancies and all this sort of thing. And I ran across Alex Comfort again as a gerontologist. So that's going on. And then a few years after that, a friend of mine suggested to me a book that Alex had written that I'd never heard of called Authority and Delinquency in the Modern State, which was a kind of an audacious book he wrote in the early 50s, in which he basically laid out a kind of a psychopathology of the state. Why is it that people in high positions in government are able and willing to order atrocities, napalming villages, saturation bombing civilian populations and so forth, and still be regarded as sane, rational people? Why does the state, does government and the state select for people like this? Does it encourage people who are somewhat sociopathic to serve in public roles? And I was sort of blown away by this. I'd never seen a book that critiqued the state in this way. And so at this point, I kept running into this Alex Comfort person. And you got to remember, when I first saw The Joy of Sex, I thought, wait a second, that can't be a real name, Dr. Alex Comfort. That sounded like something made up. But then I kept running into it, so okay, he's a real person. Now, can I find out more about him? And I found the only book that had ever been written about him was a very short study of him as a poet and novelist that was written in the 70s. So I thought, this is not adequate. Somebody needs to write a biography of this guy. And I did a little looking and scrounging, and I was able to locate a couple people who had written scholarly papers about him, one of whom put me in touch with Alex's son, who is now in his 70s, is a semi-retired journalist. And I got in touch with him, and he was willing to help me out, put me in, tell me where the papers were, etc. And open up some of his papers and family archives and so forth to me. So that's how I got going. I started researching. I did my initial interviews for the book in 2008. At the time, I was still finishing another book. I then got into another book. I was working full-time for a couple of years. So everything was kind of start and stop. And then, as I was mentioning to a couple people, I literally decided to finish the whole thing up once COVID started, and I literally dropped all my freelance writing work, all my clients, and finished up the book in about a year and a half. Since then, I've been trying to sort of rebuild my finances and so forth as well, get the book out there. So that's really what brings me in front of you today. Is that whole kind of it goes back, this year, actually I should mention this, is that last week of August was the 50th anniversary of Joy of Sex hitting the #1 spot on the Times hardcover bestseller nonfiction list for the first time. So literally it's 50 years. It's literally sort of the 50th anniversary of Joy of Sex. So it's very appropriate we're sitting here now to talk about it.
You've given us a lovely summary of how Dr. Comfort came to write The Joy of Sex in order to offer informative, educational material about sexuality, and how you came to writing about this. And you've mentioned that you were in touch with Alex Comfort's son, but you haven't told us very much about his private life. We've heard about his professions. Will you share a little bit with us about his life outside work.
Yes, yes. Alex was, let me start out with a story from his childhood. When Alex was 15 years old, it was 1935, and it was the Golden Jubilee of King George V. And Alex and a friend of his decided to make fireworks for this event. And unfortunately, they decided to do it in a small greenhouse in Alex's parents' backyard. Naturally, there was an explosion, glass flying everywhere. His left hand was badly damaged. He was initially told it would have to be amputated. It was not, but he lost 4 fingers of his left hand. So all he had left was a thumb. This was something that never deterred him. He became a doctor, he became a scientist, etc. But it kind of served a purpose of setting him apart a little bit, which he always was, because he was sort of a whiz kid who didn't really have a lot of close friends. And so he was always a little bit of an outsider in a weird sort of way, although he was a very charming and articulate person who was very funny. If I don't get a chance to tell you later on, I'll tell you now, he had an inexhaustible supply of limericks for every occasion. You know, so he was, but you have to remember that this is a person who went through life with a fairly severe disability. He nevertheless got married soon after university. Had a son in the late 40s, lived a fairly quiet life in a suburb of London. And then when he was about 40, and he was already writing about sex at this point, but from a kind of a professional standpoint. He was writing books for doctors, counselors, therapists. I had forgotten, I have to apologize, I was going to bring with me a copy of Alex Comfort's first book on sex, which was published in 1948, and the title of it is Barbarism and Sexual Freedom, Problems of Sexual Behavior from the Standpoint of Anarchism. And it was published by Freedom Press, which was the anarchist publisher and bookstore in the UK at the time. He wrote many pamphlets and books for Freedom Press. So it's 1960, Alex is 40 years old, well-known person in the UK, and he had a kind of a midlife crisis, and he began an affair with a woman named Jane Henderson, who was a family friend, which developed into kind of an open marriage. He spent the weekends with his wife Ruth and his son Nick in the suburb of Loughton, and he spent the weekdays at Jane's flat in London. And they basically began a kind of a midlife rediscovery of sex together. They tried different, they looked at sex manuals from way back. They kept a notebook. They took Polaroids of things they did. They put together a kind of a notebook called The ABC of Love by John Thomas and Lady Jane, which was a sort of a private thing that they shared with a couple of friends here and there. And finally, about the time Joy of Sex came out, coincidentally, Alex and Ruth finally divorced, and Alex married Jane. So there was a kind of literally he was, I guess in a weird way you could say he was living the sexual revolution that was happening in the 60s. Almost simultaneous, he had this sort of unconventional sex life that he was leading by, personally. He used to be famous, well, not famous, but he had this practice. He had a Volkswagen van that he used to drive around, and he had a condom taped to the windshield up above the rear view mirror, which is this sort of like his countercultural statement, at the time. So so he was kind of a sex rebel in a very middle class kind of way. There's nothing more than middle class, especially in Britain, about having a kind of a double relationship like this. It's part of the sort of the keep calm and carry on kind of stiff upper lip thing. Well, we've got this relationship going on. Let's just make the best of it. So that's the other background to the Joy of Sex is that notebook and sort of the lore that he compiled in it. So he always told different stories about how the joy of sex came about. One was that he wrote it in 2 months. Another was that he wrote it in 6 months. But the truth is that he'd been doing research, including corresponding with the Kinsey Institute, for a couple of decades before that book happened. He was already kind of notorious in Britain as a sort of a sex radical advocate of greater sexual freedom. So, but that's how the sort of the private life dovetails with the public life.
I want to ask you now how the focus on sex, which doesn't seem related to everything that he did, was there a red thread connecting all of this?
Like the personal and the political.
Well, perhaps the personal and political, you'll have to tell us.
Yeah. Alex, the other part of his life was that he was an anarchist political theorist. He was an activist. During World War II, he was a pacifist. He wouldn't have been drafted anyway because A, he had a damaged left hand, and B, because he was a medical student. And they didn't draft medical students on the presumption that they would serve somehow as medics during the war. But he insisted on registering as a conscientious objector anyway. By the time the war was over, he was identifying as an anarchist because he felt that to be a pacifist, you have to, at least on some level, be an anarchist, because disobedience and the personal responsibility to disobey when the society or the state is going in the wrong direction is something that has to be fundamental to what you do. So Alex's anarchism was something that got him thinking more deeply about society and what constitutes a responsible society that's willing to disobey and that's willing to say no when governments are telling them to do something they know is wrong. And he gradually developed a kind of an idea which he refined over the decades about what the role of sex is in society. We're typically we tend to think of sex as having two roles. One is procreation and one is pleasure. Not necessarily in that order. Alex added a third element which he called sociality. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, socialization is how we sort of internalize the norms and the thinking of the society as a whole. Don't do this, don't do that. Here's what's normal to do. Here's what's not normal. Sociality is about how we learn to cooperate. It's how people learn to say, all right, what are your needs? What are my needs? How do we arrive at a way of satisfying both of them, for you and for me, and to have satisfying lives together? And mutual aid, of course, is the kind of the central principle of anarchism. It's the attempt to create a society built on mutual aid rather than on competition. And sociality is the way that we learn mutual aid. Now, Alex thought that he looked at sex as being the most fundamental way, starting at an early age, that we begin to practice mutual aid or practice sociality. Two people in bed with each other, or even just teenagers, making out, saying, what do you want? What do I want? How do we cooperate to achieve them? In other words, sex should not be about. It should not be violent. It should not be about power. It shouldn't be about one person having power over the other. It shouldn't be a gladiatorial contest of some kind. It should be about sociality. It should be about how we achieve this, on the most basic level between two individuals. And Alex felt that the society we had is violent, is exploitative, is dominated by power relationships, and this is damaging the capacity for sex to help us achieve sociality. So you have a kind of a vicious cycle developing where you have a violent society which makes sex which inculcates violence and power relationships into sex, which makes it more difficult for sex to help us achieve sociality, which in turn makes the society more liable to be violent and exploitative, which in turn makes sex the same way. So you have so he saw a vicious cycle going on. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he once said that in fact, he said it in this book, Barbarism and Sexual Freedom, that a healthy revolt against war and against violence would do more to achieve better sex than anything else we could do politically. That sex doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's something that is very closely integrated with the kind of society we have. And so it's important that literally sexual freedom, the abolition of war, all of this is related to one to the other very, very closely. And this was really kind of, Joy of Sex in a way was his attempt to smuggle some of this agenda into the middle class living room and coffee table with this attractive book, with these attractive paintings and drawings that you didn't have to be embarrassed to look at. But if you really imbibed the message of Joy of Sex, that it would help to encourage people to practice a better form of sociality than they had been. So that's kind of how it all fit together for him.
You've talked also about your own process in writing, starting in 2008. So 15 years. The book is the product of 15 years.
Start and stop.
Start and stop, not 15 years full time, and putting it down for times, working full time. I understand the material aspects of what's difficult in terms of keeping body and soul together as a writer, but I want to ask you, this is a very full life. And I suspect that even with a big book, you don't have everything in it. Was it hard to try to compress a perhaps more full life than some other book topics have lived? How did you choose what to put in, what to keep out, and how hard was that?
It was difficult. There's two aspects to it. First of all, is that I not only had to write about about Alex's life, chronologically. First he did this, then he did this, then he did this. But I had to put it in context. I couldn't just say, well, he began to do this work on human aging and involved doing this. I had to put that in context. Like, what was the state of the study of human aging at the time that he started working on it? What was this field he was diving into? There's tons of context that needs to be provided here. And so that was really the thing, is that I could have gone on for hundreds of pages, giving as full a picture as possible of every single one of the disciplines and the areas that he was involved in. But I had to really become very adept at compressing that, because otherwise I'd be spending 5 pages on Alex Comfort and 10 pages on the campaign against nuclear disarmament. I had to say something about it, otherwise the context wouldn't be clear. But I had to be careful not to overload it that way. The other thing was that literally he's involved at every stage in his life. It's like he's involved in 6 things at once, and so I couldn't just say, all right, first he did this, then he did this, then he did this. It was kind of like a process of 3 steps forward and 1 step back, by which I mean that, I talk about his work in the nuclear disarmament movement up to 1952 in chapter 5. And then I have to go back a little bit and say, all right, meanwhile he was starting to work on human aging, and in 1948 he was hired to do this, etc. So it was sort of like I'm writing chronologically, but every now and then I'm doubling back to pick up on another thread of what he was doing. And I got a great piece of advice from a friend who's also a biographer, who had just written a triple biography of 3 people who were involved in the Spanish Civil War. And she said, if you're going to write a book about this, unless you're going to write part 1 about one person, part 2 about the next person, part 3 about the third person, if you're going to try and keep it chronological, you need to avoid at all costs using the word meanwhile. Because otherwise it's all choppy. It's like, okay, meanwhile he was doing this other thing. Every time I switched to a different thing, from gerontology to the next novel he was writing, I had to kind of find a way to transition that made it clear that there's some kind of relationship between the two, which is not always easy, but that was the challenge, is to try and write about writing, it's like almost writing about 6 people at the same time, but make it flow, make it so that the story kind of keeps flowing in a nice way. And that was difficult, but it was also really stimulating and interesting to do. It was part of what was fun about the book, was that challenge of how to tell this story in a way that pulled it together, didn't make it seem like I'm writing about 6 different things at once. Keep it together.
That's a very writerly problem, and you've tackled it well. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And so now you've told us about the most difficult thing. I would really like to hear what's the most fun thing that you learned or experienced in the writing process. Actually, I'd like to know both.
Yeah, the most fun thing, and what was it?
The most fun thing you learned about Alex Comfort, and the most fun aspect of writing.
Yes. Yeah, okay. I mean, I'll the most fun thing I learned was something it's more like something I deduced. I realized at a certain point, was I was writing about the way Joy of Sex was received, like the reviews it got and how it was received by the public, because it was like a cultural phenomenon, this book. And so I had to sort of write about the reaction to it, the people who were outraged, the people who really loved it, and so forth. And there was a bazillion stories. You asked me earlier about what to leave out. I could have gone on for a couple hundred pages just telling anecdotes about weird things that happened when The Joy of Sex came out. I'll tell you 2 things, because you asked me like the fun things I learned. Joy of Sex, I am pretty sure, was the only book that ever received positive reviews, in fact, like rave reviews, from both Ms. Magazine, feminist magazine, and from Screw, which was Al Goldstein's sort of underground sex tabloid. Both actually really, in fact, Ms. gave it actually a somewhat better review than Screw did, because the reviewer for Screw thought that it was maybe a little too middle class, whereas Ms. thought it was just really a good book. And I can't imagine another book that was as well received by both of those publications. The other thing that was really fun is there was an intentional community in Topanga Canyon in outside of LA in the early 70s called Sandstone. Has anybody here ever heard of Sandstone?
Yeah.
You've heard, yeah. It was started by this couple who wanted to create a kind of an intentional community where free love was practiced. That was sort of somewhat of a mutual aid community, and they purchased this really amazing property on a ridge looking over the ocean in Topanga Canyon, and it became a kind of a famous place. Sandstone was written up. There was a documentary film about it, which you can see on Canopy, I think. You can look it up. It was nominated for an Oscar, and it's pretty good. But Sandstone became sort of a famous place. Like celebrities went there. Everybody from Sammy Davis Jr. to Daniel Ellsberg went to Sandstone. Alex discovered Sandstone fairly early on and was there fairly often at one point. And he has a chapter on it in More Joy of Sex, which is the sequel to Joy of Sex. And I didn't really know much about Sandstone, and I thought, well, this isn't a major part of the whole story, but it's interesting. And I was able through Facebook to get in touch with one of the veterans of Sandstone, one of the people who was there back in the early 70s, and he put me in touch with a whole bunch of people. I wound up interviewing a dozen Sandstone veterans, and then visiting what's left of the place on the ridge in Topanga Canyon. And I heard so many hilarious stories. I heard so much great stuff, some of which is in the book. I mean, I've got anecdotes from Betty Dodson, who was the woman who taught the women of America to masturbate again. About her time, about the time she had group sex with Alex at Sandstone. It wasn't exactly, again, it's not a big part of the book, but it was one of the most terrifically fun parts, because the Sandstone people were actually pretty wonderful and hilarious people. And I never would have got to go to this place in Topanga Canyon if I'd never written this book. I mean, I'm standing in this spot, which is amazing, and thinking, you know, this wasn't my intention, but this is really fun. You know, I was having a great time writing this book. So that stuff like that happens. I mean, the whole project was super fun to do. The research, you know, I was fortunate in a couple of respects. One of which is that about 90% of Alex's papers are at University College London, which was his big affiliation for many years. And so it was fairly easy. It was weeks and weeks and weeks over like 2 different visits to go through everything. And then the rest of the sex-related stuff is all at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. So I was able to go there and go through the Kinsey collection, which is it was mind-blowing in a lot of ways. And so I was able to do that core research in a fairly, you know, a fairly easy way. I wound up looking at archives all over the place, which was not easy during COVID, believe me. But the key stuff I was able to do in a fairly easy way. And it was fun. I mean, going through the letters and the papers and all the stuff that he collected was just terrific. So, but I've got to single out Sandstone as being like the unexpected dividend in terms of just having a great time doing the thing.
Do you have questions? Rebecca, and then Raina, and then did you have your hand up? No? Okay.
Okay, 2 totally different questions.
Right.
One, would you consider writing a kind of a more, for more the general public or the curious public, just a book about the joy of sex?
One thing I would like to do is to repeat Rebecca's question, which is, would you, Eric, write a book about the joy of sex for the general public?
You know, possibly, not exactly that, but I've thought a couple of times about writing a book about the joy of sex and its successors. And what I mean by that is that one of the things the book did is, like I said, is that he was essentially reviving a 1,000-year-old tradition of sex manuals. And what happened after The Joy of Sex came out is that there was an explosion of sex manuals. I mean, you can get sex manuals for fundamentalist Christians, for practicing Muslims, for the disabled. Alex wrote a book for therapists on sex for the disabled later on. There's tons of them out there now. And the interesting thing is that they all draw a little bit from the voice in his book, because what set The Joy of Sex apart was that it wasn't, you know, boring and medical. It wasn't sleazy. It had this very relaxed, unanxious, sort of casual kind of voice, like sex is a down-to-earth thing. It's serious, but it's something that should be fun and playful. It's not a perfect book. There's some sexist attitudes and various things in it that wouldn't be considered appropriate today. But all the ones that have come after it partake of this kind of voice. And I've thought about writing something about the joy of sex and its successors. In other words, about the sex manual and what it's evolved into. It's almost like a kind of a study of it as a genre, because really the joy of sex launched a whole genre in terms of how you organize, how you write a sex manual. You know, it was conceived as like kind of like the model was a cookbook. So it's got different positions, it's got starters, it's got main courses, it's got one section called sauces and pickles. You know, it's like, you know, but that was the whole idea, was to kind of make you think of sex in this kind of relaxed, humorous way, rather than as either something that's really ponderous and scientific, or something that's sleazy, or is something that's sort of like woo-woo mystic. You know, it's like, no, this is a down-to-earth thing we do, you know? So, and I'd like to write something that would kind of explore how that's filtered into the culture. That's really the key thing.
That
Your
sounds
second
great.
question?
And the second question is, what do you think makes a person a polymath, or what makes it possible for a person to be a polymath versus what we would consider to be a normal person?
Right.
For the remote audience, what makes it possible for an individual to be a polymath in contrast to those of us who are simply not that great?
Thank you.
Well
worded.
Right. Polymath versus boring, whatever. Well, that's actually, I had to think a lot about this because I think number one, a good way to start is to have a mother like Alex's mother. She was a brilliant woman. She was a scholar of medieval French who was from a working class family, who could have gone on to be an academic, but she became a school teacher. She brought up Alex to be a scholar and a scientist and so forth almost from the time he was born. She taught him French practically before he could speak English. She taught him some Latin before he entered what would be first grade in Britain. She literally taught him to have an analytical mind, and a mind that could learn things fast. And not everybody has that advantage, and some people come across it just more kind of by chance, but literally by the time he was 12 years old, he was researching mollusks. And he wrote his first scientific paper on mollusks just before he entered university. And he got his PhD actually not in gerontology, not in medicine, not in sexology, but in zoology. It had to do with his papers on mollusks. So he kind of had this analytic mind that led him to kind of break things down into categories, like from an early age. That's just how his mind worked. And so he could pick up a topic and sort of organize it and classify it and deal with it that way. He had a kind of a framework for almost anything he wanted to approach. And I think that is very much like people like Leonardo da Vinci was that way, probably that way as well. W.E.B. Du Bois was a polymath. Bertrand Russell was a polymath. This is just kind of the way his mind worked. And I would add to that one of my challenges in writing this book, the ultimate challenge, was that he used to say that everything he did was part of one single project. The poetry, the novels, the scientific work, everything was part of the same project. And that was really my challenge, was to figure out what that project was, because he never actually said. And what I finally found, and this is really especially later on when I was reading his work on consciousness and the self, was I realized, okay, his project was to figure out the human, was to study every aspect and understand every aspect of the human, of what it meant to be human, of what constituted that, and what constituted the nature that surrounds us as human beings. And so that's why he got into so many areas. You could make an argument that maybe he would have had more of an impact in more areas if he'd stuck to one or two. But he couldn't do that because every single thing he did involved this whole idea of understanding this kind of self that we are, and what it meant, and what its context was. And so I think that's in a way what makes him kind of a compelling figure for me, because that's kind of like, yeah, he's a polymath, he's able to do this, but this is what we're all doing on some level as human beings. If we want to understand ourselves and our society and where we are, and so that's what it meant to be a polymath, and that's what it did for him. Let me put it that way.
Raina, your question.
Thanks. Yeah, I just was wondering, and this is sort of a two-part thing, but what would Alex Comfort have thought, or did he comment at all on, he died in 2000, I think, so I don't know how much sort of internet exposure he had, but did he have thoughts about the way the internet changed the conversation around sex, and do you have thoughts about that? I mean, there's like a whole industry now, right? You can find anything online, and I think it's made things better and worse,
For the remote audience, the question is, what would Dr. Comfort, or what did he think of the internet's impact on sex and sexuality, And what does Eric Laursen think about the internet's impact on sex and sexuality, for good and bad?
Well, here's the thing, is that Alex died in 2000, but he had a stroke in 1991 that basically made him, I mean, his mind was still good, but he wasn't able to write, he wasn't able to be really very active for the rest of his life. And literally, his son told me that Alex was literally like 2 weeks away from buying his first computer when he had the stroke. This is like 1991, and he was like, okay, it's time for me to get into this. So we'll never know what he would have thought of the internet, what he would have thought of the massive technological change that's happened since then. What I can say is that I think, and it's a really good question, like what would he say now? I think that, well, you know, I wrote a piece actually for LitHub a little while back about what would Alex have thought of the Me Too movement, and the kind of the scandals and the crimes that led up to that. And I think he would have directed us back to his thinking about sexuality. That if we want to understand where people like Harvey Weinstein come from, we have to look at the kind of society we have more broadly, you know, and the kind of society that encourages people like that. So without going into more detail, I think that's, you can look up that piece on LitHub. That's what he would have said about that. And I bring it up because, of course, Me Too, that has a lot to do with the internet, and it has a lot to do with the kind of content people see about sex online. And I think he would have been disturbed by the coarsening that that the internet creates when we talk about things like sex. But I have a hard time thinking that he would have totally blamed the technology. I think he would have probably said the technology is produced by the society we have. We have to, we can't solve it by censoring what's online or by creating, you know, blocking certain people from saying or doing certain things. Some of that might help on a marginal level, but we have to be thinking much more fundamentally about how we organize ourselves. And that would have brought him back to his anarchism, his thoughts about the state, and about how we organize ourselves as communities. So I think it would have come back to that in any case.
Yes.
So I know that he had a relationship with George Orwell. I don't think I heard anything yet about that.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah.
did you touch on that in the book? And how prevalent was that in society in terms of their relationship and whatever was happening between them in terms of the ideas they represented?
The question is about Alex Comfort's relationship with George Orwell. How much is in the book, and what else can you tell?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the fascinating things about his life is during World War II, Alex was a pacifist, and what that really took the form of was being very publicly opposed to the bombing of civilian targets by the Allies during the war. In 1943, the Americans and the British bombed the city of Hamburg, and they killed more people in 3 days than were killed in the entire Blitz over Britain during the course of the war. And Alex and a number of people, prominent people, were very critical of this. George Orwell took the opposite side. He said, if you're not fully in support of this war, then you are objectively pro-fascist. And Alex and Orwell had a series of back and forth poems they wrote in Tribune, which was the Labour Party, you know, left-wing newspaper in Britain, attacking each other around this issue. After the war, they became friends, partly because they were both opposed to the bomb. They both wrote angry letters opposed to the atomic bomb right after Hiroshima. But also they were involved with defending Freedom Press, which had been raided by the authorities for attempting to undermine the morale of His Majesty's troops. And so Orwell and Alex Comfort were both on the Freedom Defense Committee, which defended people who were basically prosecuted for political reasons in the final days of the war. Later on, and I wound up writing a separate book about this a few years ago called The Duty to Stand Aside, which is a study of of Orwell and Comfort's positions on war, pacifism, and the state. Some of that's incorporated in this book because I had to tell the story. But I'll tell you the weird sequel to it, which is that late in life, Orwell wrote a list of people which he gave to the Foreign Office, which is a list of people he felt were ideologically unreliable, who should not be used in broadcasts to Eastern Europe, for example, after the Iron Curtain came down, because he felt they were not totally loyal. And the list is a wacky list. It goes from everybody from members of parliament to Orson Welles and Katharine Hepburn to Alex Comfort. And the entry on Alex Comfort says something along the lines of very brilliant, has damaged left hand, was objectively pro-German during the war. So he still had not got over this. This list was rumored to exist for years, and it was finally published partially in the early 90s with the names of the people who are still alive excised out of it. Alex, according to his son Nick, never knew that Orwell included him in any list of this kind. And the full list was not actually published until after Alex died. So he never knew that he was included in this list. And there's literally an article in the London Review of Books this week that discusses Orwell and the list. It's been a kind of a constant topic among Orwell scholars for years now. And I could go into some detail about my thoughts about it, but that's the weird kind of trajectory of their friendship. It was very, Alex said later on, he wrote a really revealing piece about his relationship with Orwell back in the 80s for a volume about 1984, and he said, he was talking about their clash during the war, and he said, remember this is looking back like 40 years on the war, and he said, all of us were making agonizingly difficult moral and ethical decisions at a time when it seemed like everything in the world depended on it. And I think that's what he would have said if he'd known about the list. He would have said, I think he would have forgiven Orwell on some level and just said, look, this was messing with our minds. It was literally, we were trying to do the right thing at a time when it was extraordinarily difficult to figure out what the right thing was to do.
Not like now.
Right. We could name a few things that are going wrong right now. No, for sure.
More audience questions? I'd like to congratulate on a masterful biography.
Thank you.